Malcolm X, originally named Malcolm Little, was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, into a world that would profoundly shape his consciousness and activism. Understanding his early life is crucial to grasping the formation of his later identity as a civil rights leader and outspoken advocate for Black empowerment. His family background was deeply intertwined with the legacy of racial discrimination and violence prevalent in early 20th century America, laying the groundwork for the fierce resilience and militancy that characterized his later years. Malcolm's father, Earl Little, was an outspoken Baptist minister and a dedicated supporter of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNI, which promoted Blacks' self-reliance and pride. Earl's activism made the Little family a target of racial hostility. The Little family faced numerous threats from white supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Legion, a white vigilante group active in Michigan and the Midwest. These early experiences of intimidation and violence embedded a deep awareness of systemic racism in young Malcolm. The family's experiences of racial terror escalated in 1929 when their home in Lansing, Michigan, was burned down by an unknown arsonist believed to be connected to white supremacist violence. This traumatic event forced the Littles into a precarious and unstable living situation, highlighting the precariousness of Black life in segregated America. The psychological and material toll on the family would profoundly influence Malcolm's views on racial injustice. In 1931, tragedy struck again when Earl Little was found dead, reportedly killed by a streetcar, though the circumstances surrounding his death were suspicious and widely believed by the family to be a racially motivated murder. The loss of his father left Malcolm and his siblings vulnerable both economically and emotionally. His mother, Louise Little, struggled to provide for her children amidst systemic neglect and hardship, and she faced her own battles with mental health, ultimately being institutionalized when Malcolm was still a teenager. Following his mother's institutionalization, Malcolm and his siblings were split up and placed in foster homes or institutions, an experience that alienated him and contributed to his sense of displacement and loss. The fragmentation of the family unit reflected broader patterns of social disruption faced by many African American families subjected to poverty, racism, and state neglect during the era. For Malcolm, this period was marked by confusion, instability, and an early confrontation with the harsh realities of racialized social control. During his adolescence in Boston and later in Harlem, Malcolm navigated a complex social environment that contrasted sharply with his childhood experiences. Harlem, in particular, was a vibrant cultural and political hub for African Americans, but also a site of poverty and crime. His exposure to this milieu played a pivotal role in shaping his worldview, as he encountered both the potential and the challenges of urban Black life. Malcolm's early encounters with both crime and culture in Harlem would later inform his complex views on Black identity and survival. Educationally, Malcolm was a bright student in his early years, but grew disillusioned with the prospects available to Black youth in America. He experienced firsthand the limitations imposed by systemic racism on Black advancement. His ambition to become a lawyer was discouraged by a teacher who bluntly told him that the dream was unrealistic for a Black boy. This moment was pivotal in his disillusionment with integrationist approaches to racial equality and planted early seeds of skepticism about white America's willingness to accept Black progress. The broader historical context of Malcolm's early life also must be acknowledged. Born during the Jim Crow era, his formative years coincided with pervasive segregation, disenfranchisement, and racially motivated violence that defined African American life in the early 20th century. The Great Migration, which brought many black families from the rural South to northern cities like Omaha, Boston, and New York, was reshaping demographics and social dynamics, but also intensified racial tensions in urban areas. Following the fragmentation of his family and the upheaval of his early childhood, Malcolm's adolescence was characterized by a turbulent search for identity amid challenging urban environments. After being separated from his siblings, Malcolm moved to Boston to live with his half-sister, Ella Little, who became an important influence during these formative years. Despite Ella's attempts to guide him toward a more stable path, Malcolm found himself increasingly drawn into a world that would later be described as one of street hustling and petty crime. Boston in the 1930s and 1940s was a city marked by stark racial divides, with African American communities struggling against economic hardship and social exclusion. Young Malcolm's immersion into this environment introduced him to a lifestyle that contrasted sharply with the disciplined upbringing his father had tried to instill. He engaged in gambling, drug dealing, and other illicit activities that provided immediate financial gain, but also deepened his entanglement with the criminal underworld. At the same time, Malcolm was highly aware of the limitations imposed on him by society. Despite his intelligence and sharpness, opportunities for advancement were scarce, especially for young black men. His experiences with racial prejudice were not limited to violent acts, but extended into everyday encounters where systemic racism curtailed his hopes. This combination of frustration and survival instincts shaped a complex worldview, one marked by defiance, skepticism, and a drive to succeed on his own terms. Malcolm's criminal activities eventually led to his arrest in 1946 on charges of burglary, resulting in a 6-year prison sentence. This period of incarceration, initially seen as a setback, became a crucial turning point in his life. In prison, Malcolm underwent a profound personal transformation, one that would set the foundation for his later political and spiritual awakening. The isolation of prison life forced him into deep self-reflection and provided the time and space to reconsider his life's trajectory. During his time behind bars, Malcolm committed himself to self-education, devouring books on history, philosophy, religion, and politics. He taught himself to read and write more effectively, improving his vocabulary and rhetorical skills, which would later become essential tools in his role as an orator. This intellectual development was not simply academic, but also deeply connected to his growing understanding of racial oppression and the global struggle for justice. One of the most influential aspects of Malcolm's prison transformation was his introduction to the teachings of the Nation of Islam through correspondence with family members and reading materials. The Nation of Islam offered a narrative of black pride, self-discipline, and empowerment that resonated strongly with Malcolm's experiences and emerging views. The organization's emphasis on racial separation and self-sufficiency contrasted with the integrationist approach that many black leaders advocated at the time. Malcolm's adoption of the Nation of Islam's beliefs marked the beginning of a new identity, both spiritually and politically. He changed his surname from Little, which he considered a slave name, to X, symbolizing the loss of his African heritage and the unknown name of his ancestors. This act of renaming was a powerful declaration of autonomy and rejection of the identities imposed by white society. Furthermore, Malcolm's prison experience instilled in him a disciplined lifestyle that included strict adherence to the Nation of Islam's moral code, abstinence from alcohol, drugs, and premarital sex, as well as a commitment to physical fitness. This transformation was not merely personal, but represented a broader commitment to a radical new philosophy that sought to uplift black people through self-respect, education, and economic independence. Upon his release in 1952, Malcolm quickly became an active member of the Nation of Islam, using his intelligence and charisma to spread its message. His ability to articulate the frustrations and aspirations of many African Americans who felt marginalized by mainstream society helped him rise rapidly through the ranks. However, this chapter of Malcolm's life is crucial not only for its narrative of struggle, but for how it laid the groundwork for his future role as a leader who could channel personal adversity into collective empowerment. Malcolm's release from prison in 1952 marked the beginning of a new chapter defined by his formal conversion to the Nation of Islam, NOI, an organization that profoundly influenced his worldview and activism. The Nation, founded in the 1930s by Wallace Fard Muhammad and later led by Elijah Muhammad, presented a unique blend of black nationalism, Islamic spirituality, and a critique of systemic racism in America. For Malcolm, the Nation of Islam was more than a religious group. It was a movement that offered solutions to the problems facing African Americans in a society riddled with segregation and discrimination. The Nation's teachings rejected the traditional narratives of integration and racial equality promoted by mainstream civil rights leaders. Instead, it emphasized the separation of black people from white society and the establishment of an independent black economy and community. This message of self-reliance and pride resonated deeply with Malcolm, who had experienced firsthand the failures of assimilationist strategies and the persistent violence against black communities. Malcolm's initial exposure to the Nation came through letters and literature while incarcerated, but his first direct contact occurred soon after his release. He sought out the Temple No. 7 in Harlem, the Nation's New York City headquarters, where he met Elijah Muhammad, the group's charismatic and secretive leader. Elijah Muhammad's persona and teachings profoundly impacted Malcolm, who saw in him a visionary capable of guiding African Americans toward empowerment and dignity. A significant aspect of Malcolm's conversion involved embracing the Nation's strict religious and moral code. The organization promoted discipline, sobriety, and abstention from behaviors considered harmful, such as drug use, alcohol consumption, and extramarital sex. These practices aligned with Malcolm's personal transformation in prison and reinforced a sense of control and purpose that had been lacking in his earlier years. Malcolm quickly became one of the Nation's most devoted members and an articulate spokesman for its message. His powerful oratory skills, combined with his personal narrative of transformation, made him a compelling figure who could draw large audiences. He traveled extensively, establishing new temples across the United States, recruiting members, and building the Nation's profile as a formidable force in the Black liberation movement. The Nation's teachings also included a distinct interpretation of history and theology. It posited that white people were a race created by a scientist named Yakub to oppress black people, a narrative that was controversial but served as a framework for understanding racial dynamics. Malcolm embraced these ideas early on, using them to challenge white supremacy and advocate for black self-defense rather than nonviolent resistance. Malcolm's role within the Nation grew rapidly, and by the mid-1950s, he was recognized as the organization's leading minister and national spokesperson. His ability to articulate the frustrations of African Americans, combined with his relentless critique of systemic racism, earned him both admiration and hostility. He skillfully used media appearances and public speeches to challenge prevailing racial narratives and demand justice and equality on uncompromising terms. Despite the Nation's strict hierarchy and secrecy, Malcolm's relationship with Elijah Muhammad was complex. He admired Muhammad's leadership, but also sought to expand the organization's influence and adapt its strategies to address the urgent social and political challenges of the time. This dynamic would later contribute to tensions between Malcolm in the nation's leadership, but during this period, their partnership was largely productive. Conversion to the Nation of Islam was not simply a religious awakening for Malcolm, but a radical political and social commitment. It marked the beginning of his emergence as a prominent figure who rejected the dominant civil rights tactics of integration and nonviolence, instead advocating for black pride, economic self-sufficiency, and the right to self-defense. Following his conversion to the Nation of Islam, Malcolm quickly distinguished himself as a dynamic and charismatic figure capable of energizing black communities with the organization's message. His rise as a leader within the nation was marked by his extraordinary ability to communicate the struggles and aspirations of African Americans in a way that was unapologetically militant and empowering. This phase of his life saw Malcolm transition from a committed member to one of the most influential voices in the fight for black self-determination. Malcolm's leadership style was characterized by an unyielding commitment to discipline and rigorous public engagement. Unlike many civil rights leaders of his era, who emphasized conciliatory rhetoric, Malcolm's speeches were direct and confrontational, critiquing the hypocrisy of American democracy and exposing the systemic nature of racial oppression. His speeches resonated deeply with many African Americans who felt marginalized and disillusioned by the slow pace of change through traditional political means. One of the defining strategies Malcolm employed was the use of media. He understood early on the power of radio, newspapers, and television to amplify his message beyond the walls of Nation of Islam temples. His sharp wit, articulate delivery, and compelling personal narrative made him a sought-after figure for interviews and debates. These appearances helped bring the nation's message into mainstream awareness, increasing its membership and political influence significantly during the 1950s. Malcolm's ability to organize and mobilize was another key factor in his rise. He traveled extensively across the country, establishing new Nation of Islam temples in cities with significant African American populations. Each temple served not only as a religious center, but as a hub for community support, economic development, and political activism. Malcolm's efforts helped transform the nation from a relatively obscure group into a nationwide movement. His growing prominence within the nation also attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies, including the FBI. Malcolm's outspoken criticism of police brutality, racial segregation, and economic exploitation was seen as a threat by authorities, leading to surveillance and attempts to undermine his influence. This adversarial relationship with the state only reinforced Malcolm's belief in the necessity of self-defense and political vigilance. Within the African American community, Malcolm's rise was met with a mix of admiration and controversy. Many black leaders from the mainstream civil rights movement, such as Martin Luther King Jr., viewed Malcolm's approach as too radical and divisive. Nevertheless, Malcolm's insistence on black empowerment and his critique of integrationist policies attracted a substantial following among younger African Americans who were impatient with gradualist approaches. Malcolm also emphasized the importance of economic independence as a cornerstone of black liberation. He encouraged black communities to establish their own businesses, schools, and social institutions, fostering a sense of pride and collective strength. This economic nationalism was a distinctive feature of his leadership and set him apart from other leaders who focused primarily on legal and political reforms. Despite his rapid ascent, Malcolm remained a disciplined student of history and politics, continually refining his ideas through study and debate. He was well-versed in global struggles against colonialism and imperialism, which influenced his understanding of the African American fight for justice as part of a larger worldwide movement. This international perspective broadened the scope of his activism and connected him with emerging global leaders. The tension between Malcolm's increasing public profile and the Nation of Islam's internal hierarchy began to grow during this period. While he was the organization's most visible figure, the leadership structure demanded loyalty and control that sometimes conflicted with Malcolm's ambition and ideas. These underlying tensions foreshadowed the eventual split that would redefine his path. Malcolm X's philosophy and ideology were pivotal in defining his unique place within the struggle for African American liberation. His thought combined elements of Black nationalism, racial pride, self-defense, and spiritual identity, forming a comprehensive worldview that challenged the dominant narratives of racial integration and nonviolence espoused by many civil rights leaders of the 1950s and 1960s. This chapter explores the core components of Malcolm's intellectual framework and the principles that guided his activism. At the heart of Malcolm's ideology was a rejection of the notion that Black Americans should passively accept second-class status within a racially segregated society. Instead, he argued for an assertive and unapologetic assertion of Black identity, one that demanded dignity, respect, and self-determination. This ethos was reflected in his famous declaration that by any means necessary was the rightful approach to achieving freedom and equality. This phrase underscored his willingness to advocate self-defense and, if needed, militant resistance against racial oppression. Malcolm's philosophy was deeply rooted in a materialist understanding of racial and economic exploitation. He viewed the systemic racism entrenched in American society as not only a moral failing, but as a deliberate economic and political structure designed to maintain white supremacy and Black subjugation. This analysis placed race relations within a broader context of power dynamics and social control, influencing Malcolm's call for fundamental structural change rather than incremental reform. Central to Malcolm's worldview was the emphasis on self-reliance within the Black community. He championed the idea that African Americans should build independent economic institutions, educational systems, and cultural organizations as a means of empowering themselves. This principle of economic nationalism was not merely pragmatic, but also symbolic, representing a break from dependence on white-dominated systems and an embrace of Black pride and agency. Religious belief also played a critical role in shaping Malcolm's ideology, particularly during his time with the Nation of Islam. The group's distinctive interpretation of Islam, which emphasized Black superiority and separation from white society, informed Malcolm's early teachings. This spiritual framework gave his political arguments a sense of divine justice and moral authority, framing the struggle for Black liberation as not only political, but also sacred. Malcolm's rhetoric often incorporated historical references to African civilizations and heroes, aiming to reconnect African Americans with a proud heritage that had been systematically erased or distorted by Western narratives. By invoking figures like Marcus Garvey and the legacy of ancient African kingdoms, he sought to instill a sense of historical continuity and cultural pride that countered the internalized racism fostered by centuries of oppression. A key aspect of Malcolm's ideology was its internationalist dimension. He saw the plight of African Americans as part of a global struggle against colonialism, imperialism, and racial injustice. This perspective led him to establish ties with liberation movements in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, positioning Black Americans within a worldwide network of oppressed peoples seeking freedom and dignity. This global outlook distinguished him from many of his contemporaries and broadened the scope of his activism. Malcolm was also a fierce critic of the American political system, which he regarded as fundamentally hypocritical. He exposed the contradictions between America's professed ideals of freedom and democracy and its reality of racial segregation, police brutality, and economic inequality. His critique extended to both major political parties, which he saw as complicit in maintaining systemic racism, and to liberal reformers whom he accused of naivety or appeasement. Despite his early advocacy for racial separation, Malcolm's evolving thinking began to incorporate a more nuanced understanding of race and unity. Although this shift became more pronounced after his break with the Nation of Islam, the seeds of a broader, more inclusive approach to human rights and solidarity were evident in his later speeches and writings. This intellectual evolution demonstrated his capacity for critical self-reflection and adaptation. As Malcolm X's leadership within the Nation of Islam solidified, his influence extended well beyond the confines of the organization's temples, reaching a national audience eager for change. The 1950s and early 1960s were transformative years for both Malcolm and the African American struggle, and his emergence as a national figure altered the discourse around race relations in the United States. This chapter explores how Malcolm's growing prominence shaped public perception, challenged existing civil rights paradigms, and influenced the broader socio-political landscape. Malcolm's speeches attracted increasingly large crowds, not only in major urban centers like New York, Chicago, and Detroit, but also in smaller cities where Black populations sought a voice that resonated with their frustrations. His ability to articulate the pain, anger, and aspirations of Black Americans in stark and unapologetic terms drew attention from media outlets and political figures alike. This visibility helped the Nation of Islam grow rapidly, with membership numbers swelling and new temples established nationwide. One of the key elements contributing to Malcolm's national prominence was his skillful use of mass communication. His fiery debates on radio and television programs brought his uncompromising views into the living rooms of a diverse American audience. Often challenging the prevailing narratives of peaceful integration, Malcolm forced a national conversation about the legitimacy of self-defense and the depth of systemic racism. His presence in mainstream media was unprecedented for a Black leader who openly rejected nonviolence as the sole strategy for social change. Malcolm's rise coincided with the burgeoning civil rights movement, but his approach often placed him at odds with its most visible leaders. While figures like Martin Luther King Jr. championed nonviolent protest and legislative reform, Malcolm called for a more militant stance, criticizing what he saw as the ineffectiveness of peaceful demonstrations. This ideological divergence generated significant debate within the Black community and beyond, illustrating the spectrum of strategies considered necessary to combat racial injustice. The national response to Malcolm's prominence was polarized. Supporters admired his courage and clarity, viewing him as a beacon of hope and a symbol of resistance. Conversely, detractors, ranging from government officials to mainstream media commentators, labeled him a radical and agitator, often emphasizing the more controversial aspects of his rhetoric to marginalize his influence. This dichotomy underscored the contentious nature of race relations in America during this period. Malcolm's speeches frequently addressed international audiences as well, connecting the African American struggle to anti-colonial movements worldwide. His framing of civil rights as part of a global fight against oppression resonated with leaders in Africa and the Caribbean, fostering solidarity that extended beyond American borders. This global dimension enhanced Malcolm's stature, making him not only a national figure, but an international symbol of resistance to racial and imperial domination. In addition to public speaking, Malcolm's influence manifested through community activism. He advocated for economic empowerment initiatives such as Black-owned businesses and cooperative ventures, which aim to reduce dependence on white economic structures. This practical activism complemented his ideological message, providing tangible opportunities for African Americans to assert their independence and build communal strength. Malcolm's charismatic leadership and growing following also led to increased surveillance and harassment from government agencies. The FBI and other law enforcement bodies monitored his activities closely, fearing his ability to inspire unrest. This scrutiny often manifested in attempts to sow discord within the Nation of Islam and among Malcolm supporters, illustrating the perceived threat he posed to the established order. Despite these challenges, Malcolm's public impact persisted and even expanded. His willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about race and power forced many Americans to reconsider their assumptions. His critiques of economic inequality, political hypocrisy, and social injustice found echoes in emerging movements and influenced subsequent generations of activists who sought more radical approaches to civil rights. Malcolm X's break with the Nation of Islam in 1964 was a pivotal moment that dramatically altered the course of his life and legacy. The split was the result of mounting tensions within the organization, ideological disagreements, and personal revelations that challenged the foundation of his beliefs and his relationship with the group's leadership. This chapter explores the complex factors that led to Malcolm's departure and the transformative impact it had on his worldview and activism. Tensions between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, the nation's leader, had been building for several years prior to the official split. While Malcolm had been one of the nation's most effective spokesmen, he increasingly chafed under the strict hierarchical control exerted by Elijah Muhammad and the Inner Circle. Malcolm's ambitious vision for expanding the nation's influence sometimes conflicted with the leadership's more cautious and secretive approach, leading to friction over strategy and direction. A major catalyst for the break was the revelation of Elijah Muhammad's personal misconduct. Rumors circulated that Muhammad had engaged in extramarital affairs, fathering children with several women within the nation's community, actions that violated the strict moral code preached by the organization. When Malcolm publicly confronted Muhammad about this hypocrisy, he found himself marginalized and condemned by the leadership, which sought to protect the leader's image at all costs. The internal conflict was compounded by Malcolm's growing desire to engage with the broader civil rights movement and global political currents. He sought alliances beyond the nation's insular framework, reaching out to other Black leaders and organizations. This outreach was viewed with suspicion and hostility by the nation's hierarchy, who preferred to maintain ideological purity and separation from mainstream activism. Another significant element of the schism was Malcolm's evolving understanding of race and religion. His increasing skepticism of the nation's rigid racial doctrines and Black separatism led him to question long-held beliefs. This intellectual evolution was accelerated by his experiences during his pilgrimage to Mecca, where he encountered a diverse and inclusive Muslim community that transcended race and nationality. This exposure broadened his perspective and challenged the nation's narrow worldview. The pilgrimage, or Hajj, marked a profound turning point. Malcolm witnessed Muslims of all races worshiping together as equals, an experience that inspired him to reconsider the possibilities for racial harmony and global brotherhood. This spiritual awakening reinforced his belief in human unity and altered his approach to activism, shifting from strict separatism toward a more inclusive, human rights-centered framework. Upon returning to the United States, Malcolm sought to establish a new organization that reflected his broadened vision. He founded Muslim Mosque Incorporated and later the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which aimed to unite African Americans with international struggles against colonialism and oppression. These efforts represented a clear break from the Nation of Islam's doctrines and a commitment to building coalitions based on shared human rights rather than racial exclusivity. The split was not without consequence. Malcolm faced intense backlash from former allies and adversaries alike. The Nation of Islam denounced him as a traitor, and he received numerous death threats. The atmosphere of hostility culminated in increased security concerns, forcing Malcolm to take precautions in his public appearances and daily life. Despite the risks, Malcolm's post-Nation period was marked by intellectual vigor and expanding influence. He continued to speak out against racial injustice, but with a more nuanced and global perspective. His speeches and writings during this time reflected his evolving ideology and his commitment to fostering unity among oppressed peoples worldwide. In 1964, Malcolm X embarked on a journey that would profoundly reshape his worldview and philosophy. The pilgrimage to Mecca, known as the Hajj, this sacred Islamic rite, obligatory for Muslims who are physically and financially able, exposed Malcolm to a global community united by faith rather than divided by race. The experience was transformative, marking a critical turning point in both his personal life and political ideology. Upon arrival in Saudi Arabia, Malcolm was immediately struck by the diversity of the pilgrims. Unlike the rigid racial segregation he had known in America, Mecca was filled with people from various ethnic, national, and racial backgrounds, worshiping together as equals. This unity under the banner of Islam challenged Malcolm's earlier beliefs, rooted in racial separatism and black nationalism. He described the scene as a powerful lesson in the possibilities of racial harmony. Malcolm observed African, Asian, Middle Eastern, and European Muslims engaging in shared rituals, demonstrating mutual respect and brotherhood. This exposure deeply impressed upon him the potential for humanity to transcend color and cultural differences. It contrasted sharply with his previous experience within the Nation of Islam, which espoused black superiority and separation from white society. Beyond the racial implications, the pilgrimage connected Malcolm to the spiritual core of Islam. The rituals, prayers, and sense of submission to God provided a profound sense of peace and purpose. For Malcolm, this spiritual renewal complemented his political awakening, reinforcing the idea that true liberation required both inner transformation and social justice. During his time in Mecca and the broader Muslim world, Malcolm also engaged in extensive dialogue with Muslims and scholars from across the globe. These interactions broadened his understanding of the political struggles facing people of color worldwide, from anti-colonial movements in Africa to civil rights struggles in America. This global perspective reinforced his conviction that the fight against oppression was a universal human endeavor. The pilgrimage inspired Malcolm to rethink the rigid racial categories that had previously defined his activism. He came to reject the simplistic dichotomy of black versus white and embraced a more inclusive view that recognized the complexity of identity and the possibility of solidarity across racial and cultural lines. This evolution was a significant departure from his earlier positions and would shape his future efforts to build coalitions. Upon returning to the United States, Malcolm sought to share the insights gained from his pilgrimage. He emphasized the possibility of brotherhood among all races under the banner of shared human dignity. This message was reflected in his speeches and writings, where he advocated for human rights rather than solely racial rights, signaling a shift toward a broader civil rights framework. However, this transformation was met with skepticism and resistance by many who had known Malcolm as the fiery Nation of Islam leader. Some within the black community viewed his softened stance on racial separation as a betrayal, while others questioned the sincerity of his newfound embrace of religious pluralism and racial unity. Malcolm, however, remained steadfast in his commitment to this evolved ideology. The pilgrimage also galvanized Malcolm's efforts to establish new organizations that reflected his broadened vision. His Organization of Afro-American Unity sought to unite African Americans with global liberation movements, emphasizing cultural pride and political solidarity beyond race alone. This internationalist outlook was a direct outcome of the insights he gained during the Hajj. The final years of Malcolm X's life were a period of intense activity, evolving thought, and mounting tensions. Following his break with the Nation of Islam and his transformative pilgrimage to Mecca, Malcolm embarked on a mission to redefine both his personal identity and his role within the broader struggle for racial justice. These years were marked by new initiatives, expanding alliances, and an ever-increasing public profile that came with heightened dangers. Returning to the United States in late 1964, Malcolm found himself navigating a complex and often hostile political landscape. His more inclusive vision of racial unity and global solidarity was still unfamiliar and, to some, controversial within the African American community and beyond. Nevertheless, Malcolm committed himself to building organizations that embodied these ideals, most notably the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAU, which aimed to unite Black Americans with liberation movements worldwide. The OAU was modeled partly on the Organization of African Unity, reflecting Malcolm's broadened global perspective. The organization sought to address issues of political disenfranchisement, economic inequality, and cultural empowerment, while fostering connections between African Americans and Africans fighting colonial rule. It also emphasized human rights as a universal principle, positioning the Black struggle within an international human rights framework. During this period, Malcolm's speaking engagements increased substantially. He toured extensively, delivering speeches that highlighted the intersections of race, class, and global politics. His rhetoric now emphasized unity, justice, and the interdependence of oppressed peoples. These messages resonated with a generation increasingly disillusioned by slow progress and persistent systemic injustice, drawing a new and diverse following. However, Malcolm's expanded influence came with escalating threats. Former ties with the Nation of Islam and his public denunciation of its leadership had made him a target. Tensions between Malcolm and the nation's leadership had become dangerously personal. Reports of surveillance, harassment, and threats from various groups created an atmosphere of constant vigilance for Malcolm and his family. In February 1965, these dangers culminated in tragedy. On February 21st, during a speaking engagement at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City, Malcolm X was assassinated. The attack was sudden and brutal, with several gunmen firing multiple shots. The event shocked the nation and sent ripples throughout the civil rights movement and beyond. Malcolm's death marked a violent end to a life defined by transformation and struggle. The aftermath of the assassination revealed the complexity of Malcolm's position within the tumultuous political environment of the 1960s. Investigations pointed to members of the Nation of Islam as primary suspects, reflecting deep internal conflicts within the Black liberation movement. The incident exposed the dangerous interplay of ideology, personal rivalry, and political power that characterized the era. Despite his untimely death, Malcolm's legacy only grew stronger in the years that followed. His ideas and vision continued to influence activists, scholars, and ordinary people committed to racial justice and human rights. The shift toward Black empowerment, cultural pride, and global solidarity that he championed became foundational to later movements such as Black Power and Pan-Africanism. The legacy of Malcolm X endures as one of the most powerful and transformative in modern history, impacting not only the struggle for civil rights in America, but also the global discourse on race, identity, and justice. His life, marked by continual evolution and radical thought, left an indelible imprint on politics, culture, and social movements. This chapter examines the multifaceted nature of Malcolm's legacy and the broad influence he continues to wield across diverse arenas. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Malcolm's ideas gained a renewed urgency among activists frustrated by the slow pace of racial progress. His call for self-determination, Black pride, and uncompromising resistance to oppression resonated deeply with younger generations who sought more assertive approaches to civil rights. The Black Power movement of the late 1960s and 1970s drew heavily on Malcolm's rhetoric and philosophy, emphasizing empowerment and cultural affirmation. Malcolm's insistence on economic independence inspired numerous community-based initiatives aimed at fostering Black entrepreneurship and self-sufficiency. These efforts manifested in the creation of Black-owned businesses, cooperative economics, and educational programs tailored to uplift African American communities. His vision challenged systemic economic exclusion and encouraged collective action as a means of achieving lasting change. In academic circles, Malcolm X's life and teachings have been the subject of extensive scholarship. Historians, sociologists, and political theorists analyze his evolving ideology, rhetorical mastery, and strategic approaches to social justice. His autobiography, co-written with Alex Haley, remains a seminal text that offers insight into his personal transformation and the broader African American experience. Malcolm's global perspective has influenced international movements for human rights and anti-colonial struggles. His articulation of Black American struggles as part of a worldwide fight against imperialism connected him with leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and Patrice Lumumba. This internationalism broadened the scope of racial justice activism, fostering solidarity among oppressed peoples across continents. Culturally, Malcolm X's image and ideas have permeated art, music, literature, and film. His life story has been retold in numerous biographies, documentaries, and feature films that capture his charisma and complexity. Musicians and poets have invoked his name to symbolize resistance and Black empowerment, embedding his influence deeply within the cultural fabric. Despite his controversial reputation during his lifetime, Malcolm has become an icon of courage and intellectual rigor. He challenged America to confront its contradictions and inspired millions to question systems of inequality. His willingness to critique both white supremacy and the limitations of mainstream civil rights strategies set him apart as a thinker unafraid to confront uncomfortable truths. Malcolm's legacy also continues to provoke debate. His early endorsement of separatism and militancy, as well as his association with the Nation of Islam, remain points of contention among scholars and activists. Yet, these aspects of his life are often reinterpreted within the context of his later transformation, highlighting the dynamism of his thought and the complexity of the struggle for justice. In contemporary movements, such as Black Lives Matter, echoes of Malcolm's influence are evident. Calls for systemic change, critiques of institutional racism, and affirmations of Black dignity draw upon the foundation he helped establish. His vision for justice rooted in self-respect and global solidarity remains a guiding force for activists today. Ultimately, Malcolm X's legacy is not confined to any single movement or ideology. It is a living testament to the power of change, resilience, and the pursuit of human dignity. This chapter affirms that Malcolm's life and ideas continue to inspire, challenge, and shape the ongoing quest for equality and freedom worldwide.